And I would also like to...
excuse me, I'm so sorry. I forgot to say something very important, even though they reminded me 3 times. I'm so sorry. We are recording tonight's event. So everyone please be aware that this is being recorded and you can change your name if you would like and ask questions anonymously if you would like. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So thank you, Laura. And I would also like to thank Robert, Nicole, Gina for your support to make this presentation happen. And so before I start, I would like to share my screen with you and then to see if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. And I would like to show a video to you first.
And it was a very old structure with different wards in sort of the equivalent of
so this was a governor of Hong Kong visiting a mental hospital in the new territory in Hong Kong.
Each ward. And I'm walking down the middle, and there's a very, very well-dressed Chinese guy who's calling from behind one of these wire fences. Governor Patton, could you come over and talk to me? And to the horror of my sort of comet's tail of officials, I walk over and talk to him. I mean, you know, it was interesting that this guy in a 3-piece suit in a mental hospital, and he's self-confident enough to want to talk to the governor. So I walk across, and he says some complimentary things, and then he says, I just want to ask you one question, Governor. He said, Britain says it's the oldest democracy in the world. So I said, yes, it's sometimes claimed. And he said, China is the last great communist power in the world, authoritarian power. And I say, yes. And he said, could you therefore explain to me how it is that Britain, the democracy, is handing over Hong Kong to an authoritarian power without consulting the people of Hong Kong, without giving them any choice? And I was getting into the car coming back, and one of my officials said to me, it's extraordinary, isn't it? He said that the man with the sanest question in Hong Kong is in a mental hospital. It was unfair.
Okay, so in fact, incarceration has not been the usual way of managing lunatics in Hong Kong. I've always joked that extradition was the way managing lunatics in Hong Kong, and it existed already in the 19th century. Right. So when we talk about the history of psychiatry or mental health in Hong Kong, people talk about John Care's Refuge. Right. This refuge is located in Canton, and it has been regarded one of the origins of mental institutions in modern Chinese history. And it's not far away from Hong Kong, it's just 80 miles away. Regarding mental institutions in China, then, there are a lot of scholars who have written quite extensively about their development. For example, recently Emily Baum at UCI Irvine has written a beautiful book examining the intersection among psychiatric science, the police, and the families in Beijing. Wenji Wang, my colleague in Taiwan, has written extensively about missionary hospitals in Shanghai. However, the notion of China is really too vast to generalize the various phases of how lunatics were managed over time. But Hong Kong is a unique example. And in this presentation, I'm trying to argue that different from the conventional writing in the history of psychiatry or history of madness, history of madmen, the history of psychiatry in Hong Kong should instead be examined not from the perspective of asylum. Right? So this is a newspaper clip. On 1927, September 16th, a man jumped into the Victoria Harbour and was rescued. And shortly after he jumped into the sea, he was spotted by a sailor on a ferry, and the ferry was not fast enough to catch up with the suicidal man who swam faster than the ferry. So when he was finally captured and got arrested by the Indian police officer, he attempted to run away again until he was chased back and restrained with ropes. He said that he came to Hong Kong from Nanjiangkou. He was a farmer from this Canton town, agricultural town, to Hong Kong to make a living. But neither did he want to become a coolie nor a policeman. So he decided to take his life, but all thoughts were blasted. Now he was awaiting the magistrate's decision to put him in the hospital or send him back to China. So this was a common scenario one could read on Hong Kong's newspapers during the first half of the 20th century. Now, in 1927, there was only one mental hospital, namely Victoria Hospital in Hong Kong. It was established, or more precisely merged in 1925 from its pre-incarnation asylums to treat mental patients of both European and Chinese origins. The hospital only had 23 beds, not enough to treat those who were possibly in need of a population of more than 700,000 some. So actually the hospital in this picture looked quite big, but actually it was just one wing containing 23 beds. So it was the time when Hong Kong began to receive rapid influx of Chinese people. Dissimilar to Britain or other East Asian colonial cities, the history of lunatics in Hong Kong cannot be understood by simply looking at asylums. In the history of psychiatry writings, asylums are very important, and there are also convenient lenses to look at regarding the governmentality of empires or other authorities over unfit individuals to regulated modern life. And in Britain's Crown Colony, mental asylums developed slowly from mid-19th century to mid-20th century. The century-long practice corroborated the old saying that described Hong Kong as a place of so-called borrowed place and borrowed time. Their sizes continuously remained small, and their therapeutic functions were restricted as compared with other asylums, either in its motherland or those developed in other cities nearby. According to historian David Wright, between 1800 and 1914, Western world saw rapid growth of mental asylums, with 300,000 individuals committed therein in England and Wales. Madness became to be defined exclusively and ambiguously as mental illness. Inmates were incarcerated for a long time, but unlike Britain, lunatics stayed in the asylum in Hong Kong only for a very short period, with their so-called illness might or might not remiss. They were admitted due to various reasons, only without proper psychiatric care. It was at the time when psychiatric professionals were still not yet available there in the colony. Managing mental patients was a measure to maintain the clean cityscape, as well as an instrument to ensure the smooth operation of the port city. Now, let's look at CARE's Refuge in Canton. Institutional power has always been concerned in the histories of medicine in Hong Kong. Hospitals and charitable organizations are always concerned by historians as facilitators of modern medicine, and prisons as well. It's a byproduct of the modern urban life. But talking about the development of psychiatry, most historians agree that John Care's Refuge was the prototype of mental hospital in southern China. From the perspective of institutional design, it was an architectural gem combining the beauty of Eastern and Western philosophy. But such historiography could easily hinder the uniqueness of Hong Kong as the nexus of a wider inter-imperial network. So we can see CARE's Refuge from a completely different perspective. First, psychiatry had little role in shaping mental health services. Second, emergence of lunatics matched the economic activities in the enlarging port city. Third, The temporary stay and the flow of lunatics in and out of mental asylums matched the map of global Chinese labor supplying chain. Here's another news clip. In July 1874, it was reported that on the Chinese newspaper that a specialized ward was designed as a part of the newly established Donghua Hospital to provide mental treatment for Dingyang, right? So lunatic in Chinese, with heavy control. In fact, insane Chinese individuals were not necessarily brought to Donghua Hospital. They sometimes were directly sent to the government civil hospital for very rough assessment. Apart from hospitals, some patients ended up in the Victoria Gaol if their cases were related to crime. In fact, inconsistent operating procedures to admit or transfer the insane were the result of lacking space for proper custody. The colonial government nevertheless could not offer a solution to deal with proliferating lunatics in Hong Kong. Instead, it began to look outward for resourceful assistance. Honored as the original model of mental hospital in modern China, CARE's Refuge was born contingently to the missionaries' strategic plans to convert Chinese in the niche missionary market and the inadequate care capacity of Hong Kong's colonial government. In 1890, the Medical Missionary Society drafted, London's Medical Missionary, no, this is the Americans Medical Missionary Society drafted a probation during its 5th assembly to study the possibility of establishing an asylum for the insane in the Chinese Empire. In contrast to Donghua Hospital's dungeon, the CARE's Refuge was a large 2-story building with wide verandas and iron bars looking out on a large lawn and overlooking the grounds of civil hospital. Each cell was a heavy door and fit with comfortable bed, the large room being the dining room. With its doors opening in 1892, the expansion of the Refuge before Asia-Pacific War relied on the influx of inmates sent up from Hong Kong, coinciding the Chinese lunatic asylum's operation beginning a year ago in the colony. So here we can say that John Care's hospital also needed money for sustaining itself, but instead of admitting patients from Canton itself and its surroundings, they relied heavily on the people from the relied heavily on the British colony. So who were the lunatics then? In Hong Kong, the emergent lunatics as the port city's outcast existed long before the building of any mental institutions. So over time, their status had been characterized in various ordinances. For example, in 1854, an ordinance was passed, quote, to invest Her Majesty's councils in the ports in China with jurisdiction over the persons and property of lunatics and persons of unsound mind, as also with the power inherent in the office of coroner, end of quote. And in 1873, insane individuals were not allowed to produce evidence at court. Like the modern legal concept of interdiction, these ordinances was made for commercial concerns to prevent insane individuals from conducting business in the Crown Colony, had to ensure the smooth practice of trade. And in 1903, the Imbecile Immigrants Ordinance further required that the owner, charter, agent, and master of every ship which brings into the colony any passenger not domiciled in the colony who at the time of his landing of either lunatism, idiotism, or imbecile, deaf, dumb, blind, or infirm. Right? By doing so, the authority was able to shirk off its responsibility having to pay up the cost resulted from any inconvenience caused. The most convenient way to manage these individuals was temporary custody. And in the 1930s, with the populations in Hong Kong further grew, defined in the Immigration and Passports Ordinance, those were classified as, again, diseased, maimed, blind, idiot, lunatic, or decrepit, and without the means of subsistence, and maybe hindered by his state from earning a livelihood, were all prevented from landing in the port, and they would be expelled. Despite the authority prevented the port city's social order being disturbed by individuals of unsound mind, lunatics still emerged in the public. Among them, two categories of people stood out: violent sailors and suicidal Chinese. They, of course, were not labeled as medically mad. Since Hong Kong, the medicalization of disorderly behaviors occurred much later than in other colonies in Asia. And before standard operation procedures were developed, measures taken to manage lunatics were harsh and inconsistent. Under British colonial rules in Hong Kong, the biggest concern for the government to provide accommodation or treatment for lunatics. Instead, it wished to send them away as soon as possible. So such mentality to keep lunacy out of sight and out of mind reflected on three perspectives of practice that lasted a century long before the end of World War II. First, capacity of various asylums was nowhere near the growing number of lunatics. Despite voices were more frequently heard to provide humanitarian custody for them, reform was slow and insidious. Second, CARE's Refuge in Canton kept expanding. Many of its inmates did not come from the Chinese inland, but sent northbound from Hong Kong. Third, how bills were settled regarding the ship fare for patients' repatriation revealed the wish for the colonial government to get rid of the plights in the colony as soon as possible. Transfer of cities' outcasts began with convicts. Quite interestingly, a curious case occurred in the asylum in Hong Kong, where the British ward master of the mental asylum, D.G. Cumming, was accused of harassing an 18-year-old woman in 1895. Cumming went into the female ward and tried to put the epileptic inmate on the bed. The woman screamed and attempted to hang herself. Cumming defended in court that his indecent behaviors were caused by the influence of liqueur, while he had been under pressure since the outbreak of bubonic plague since a year ago. So, and after the court hearing, the colonial surgeon suggested that Cumming should be removed from that position. In the end, alcohol was banned from the asylum, and the ward master was repatriated back to England. So in early 20th century, discussions was also often heard about the route to transfer criminals when they were sent among different ports in Asia. So, and repatriation of lunatics began very early when lunatic individuals began to surface in Hong Kong. While non-Chinese were mostly transferred via different routes to London, Chinese were sent to cantons after CARE's Refuge was completed in 1892. Such arrangement often encountered immense resistance from the destined countries, resulting in complex procedures being required before the removal of patients. Because transferring patients was so difficult, debates occasionally appeared about whether or not in Hong Kong a proper mental hospital was required. Over time, governors of Hong Kong kept sending requests to Britain's Secretary of State for the Colonies, expressing their very similar wish to repatriate European lunatics back to their countries. One of the reasons was then popular racialized belief on body degeneration affected by the tropical climate. For example, in 1875, Sir John Pope Hennessy, he wrote to Earl Carnarvon saying that, quote, "There were no proper means for treating lunatic patients in this colony, and while therefore the simple ground of humanity is highly important owing to the nature of the climate, that European and American pauper lunatics could be sent as soon as possible to their own countries. It is doubly necessary where the hospital accommodation lamentably deficient and unsuitable for their detention, end of quote. There were many, many letters of this kind. From different governors' perspective, the arrangement of repatriation was to ensure patients receiving the best care and treatment. However, in the distant colony and on the way of the winding journeys of repatriation, proper treatment and care was of course unavailable, and as a result, lunatics were often dumped back in Hong Kong. When mental asylums in Hong Kong were not well developed, Chinese lunatics were at times directly escorted by the police to the authorities in Canton. At that time, the action was commonly described as Daiseng. In Chinese, oh, well, this is John Pope Kennedy and his letter, right? So, yeah, Daiseng. In Chinese, Gai means to send under God. Seng, in context of Hong Kong's history, means specifically the province of Canton, the province. For example, it was reported on a piece of news that 9 lunatics arrived in Hong Kong via a ferry. They were together directly sent back to Canton. But however, by 1920s, escorts became more and more regular. Lunatics who temporarily stayed in Hong Kong were first certified by the Sanitary Board before they were sent via ferries to CARE's Refuge under the care of Guangzhou City's Office of Hygiene. However, in the second half of the 1920s, we also saw unstable relationship between 2 authorities that overturned the escorting plan in practice for years. And the map of repatriation for Chinese was in fact bigger. In 1914, 22 insane Chinese from the Oregon State Asylum for the insane were brought from Seattle to Portland and then to Hong Kong. It was made under the negotiation between the asylum superintendent with the Hong Kong's colonial government that if the patient was expected to live for more than 10 years, they would be sent back to Hong Kong. It was one of many other examples of cross-country repatriation that was previously paid less attention to. There were also documents of Chinese coolies being admitted to Yarra Bend Hospital in Victoria, Australia. Some patients, however, were unfortunately admitted only due to ill communication. They could also stay in the hospital for life until they died from infectious diseases, various infectious diseases, if no arrangement were made to take them back home. So what about Hong Kong's own mental asylums then? For decades long, the colonial government kept sending lunatics outward. It, however, could not stop various institutions within Hong Kong from transforming. In addition to the difficulties, whether external or internal, encountered while planning or executing the work of repatriation, voices within Hong Kong that called for humanitarian care for the insane were the same important. The care capacity of different asylums in Hong Kong, nevertheless, had not been satisfactory before the end of World War II. In the mid-1870s, discussions began to appear to envisage a proper asylum for lunatics in Hong Kong, like existing amenities in England at the same time. At the beginning of this presentation, I have mentioned, right, in an anonymous commentary that appeared in the newspaper. So sorry, I deleted that. So there was a commentary on the newspaper calling for humanitarian care for people in Hong Kong. There was also some documentation in government's gazettes. Recalled by the longest serving colonial surgeon, Philip Ayers, about his 1873 Dongwa hospital visit. He observed that patients there were confined in dark and dreary cells under Chinese native doctors' supervision, and those who were violent were chained like wild beasts. Apart from Dongwa Hospital, some patients end up in Victoria Gaol if their cases were related to crime. And according to the governor of Hong Kong, John Pope Hennessy, people were confined in the prison as lunatics, quote, never ought to have been inside its walls, end of quote. According to Hennessy, it is perhaps unreasonable to suppose that the current lunatic asylum is intended to be used by Chinese as well as foreigners. In 1875, a temporary asylum in Hong Kong was finally available. Located near the Hollywood Road Police Merit Quarters, so those who are in Hong Kong, it is the current PMQ. Right? It wasn't, however, built solely for European lunatics. According to Ayers in his report made in 1888, the structure was, quote, enriched, dilapidated buildings that it has been for the last 3 years, and the lunatics have to be removed in the event of any gale threatening to the police cells for safety, as I described in my report for 1880, end of quote. There was also a handful of admissions, only a handful of admissions. Many of them were not lunatics, but suspected patients having brain diseases or other kinds of illnesses. Without proper treatment happening in the asylum, most inmates were arranged to be brought back to their home country or removed by their friends or acquaintances. In around 1880, the temporary asylum was relocated to Hospital Road and became the wing of the government civil hospital. Unlike the care facilities for Europeans, those for Chinese developed much later. As mentioned before, a cell was available in Donghua Hospital. The ways in which patients were treated or just incarcerated there gradually attracted a sidelong glance. The attention was not only a result of colonizers' prejudice over Chinese management, but also benevolent attitude developing along decades of governance. And it is worth noting that the outbreak of bubonic plague in 1894 accelerated the reform of mental services for Chinese in Hong Kong. With its failed handling of treatment of plague patients during the epidemic, the question of whether or not to preserve Donghua Hospital was one of the heavily debated items in the agenda. The horrible image of the lunatic cell was by chance revealed by journalists as well as John Atkinson in the acting colonial surgeon's report. In the Hong Kong Telegraph, it was reported that the chamber horrors was a stain on our boasted civilization. Quote, the doors thrown wide open, a horrible sight presented itself to the spectator, lodged within thick hardwood bars like ferocious wild animals in a menagerie, end quote. Immediately after the exposure of through these column articles in 1894, the colonial government redirected the power of government physicians and ordered the removal of mental patients from Donghua Hospital to the government civil hospital. And in the same year, the government also began to arrange transfer Chinese patients to care refuge. The establishment of Victoria Mental Hospital, mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, clearly was neither the end of asylum period nor the end of lunatics' endless drift. In 1938, Victoria Mental Hospital was rebuilt. Even if the intake number of patients increased to 84, the care capacity was still very small compared with the rapidly growing size of the port city. And so after World War II, the government began to consider provision of proper mental health care by building large scale of mental hospitals. Trained psychiatrists began to teach at the university, see patients in mental hospitals, and cooperate with the colonial government to settle court cases related to insane criminals. Born in Malaysia and trained in Cambridge, this guy, Pao Meng Yap, PM Yap, for example, was one of the most important early figures who laid out the blueprint for the development of modern psychiatry in Hong Kong. In 1950s, with Yap's assistance, Castle Peak Hospital was planned in the new territories to provide specialized psychiatric services. However, the development represented two ironies. First, in 1949, with further influx of people in Hong Kong from China, an ordinance was passed to control the population of the colony by providing for the expulsion of undesirables. So now, by law, the undesirables included those who were defined in the old ordinance, I quote again, diseased, maimed, blind, idiot, lunatic, or decrepit, not having the means of subsistence, and may be hindered by his state from earning a livelihood, end quote. Second, the mushrooming of institutions in Hong Kong contradicted the international trend by that time to deinstitutionalize mental patients. Facilities that made the best use of Hong Kong's archipelagic nature to isolate lepers on, for example, Happy Healing Island and drug addicts on Shekgu Island further embodied the unique geopolitics of the Pearl of the Orient in the early post-war history. So unlike other colonies of either European or East Asian empires, as a free port, movement itself in Hong Kong was self-perpetuating source for profit and interest to be defended. Mental health, henceforth, was a means for the colonial authority to maintain normal functioning of the port, especially on the matter of business. Much of the intention were passive, sometimes merely practical management after crisis. And movement itself, such as the matter of repatriation, became a legitimate mega plan that safeguarded the operation of the port. Lunacy in Hong Kong thus cannot be simply portrayed through the lens of institutions. In this atypical colonial city, the ways in which lunatics were managed reflect multi-layer interests of the British Empire and other foreign stakeholders beyond the purpose of colonization. So I'll stop here first. And since it's the sample chapter I'm developing as a book project, so I welcome your questions and comments. And so lastly, I'm trying to promote my book that is going to be published next year. So this is a very different project, only looking at post-war development of mental health from a transnational perspective. So I look at the World Health Organization. So I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can read them out for you. Or you can just type that you have a question and then unmute yourself. I guess while we're waiting for other people to think of questions, I was really interested in the terminology of lunatics. And in some of the lists that you give, you say lunatics and the insane. And I'm wondering if those were understood to be different categories of people.
Okay, this is interesting. And I have to admit that the term insane is what I use. And mostly in 19th century and early 20th century, the terms used in hospitals and also in government's documents were mostly lunatics. But actually in the ordinance defined in a 1953 ordinance, it was just people of unsound mind. Seems some people are quiet.
Well, I'll ask another question again.
Sure.
I was fascinated by what you said about the bubonic plague and that it accelerated reform of mental health care. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I think this is a serendipity then, right? So, well, the story that I presented, that there are two stories in it. One is that the war master at that time, he was not a doctor. He was just a war master called D.G. Cumming, and people called him Agong. And actually, there are also female helpers, a bit like nurses nowadays, and people call them ama. Ama also are helpers. Most of them came from Canton, single women, providing their doing a lot of housework for Hong Kong people, and so Hamas are also hired in the asylum, and then so so Agong was accused for molesting a girl, and the girl attempted suicide, and so he argued that it was because of the pressure, right, and that was caused by the bubonic plague, that he had to rely on alcohol and become alcoholic, and so that resulted in his indecent behaviors. This is one of them, and then nowadays people are talking about the mental consequences of the pandemic, and we can clearly see an early example of that. And the reform of Donghua Hospital, that was just something serendipity. And then if there was no epidemic, the bubonic plague, people wouldn't have gone into the hospital and inspect the facilities of the so-called dungeon. And so, because people were talking about whether or not to abolish the Donghua Hospital, and so in the end, Donghua Hospital was preserved, right? But for that dungeon, people were trying to reform that. So mental patients were removed out of the Donghua Hospital to stay in the government civil hospital, right? So there are a lot of parallels we can draw between this current pandemic and the previous ones.
Well, thank you. We're starting to have some questions come in now. So Dylan would like to ask about processes of cultural negotiation. So how was the Chinese patient admitted? Like, who carried out the process? And who were these early native Chinese doctors? And how did Western conceptions of madness interact with those in Southern China?
So curious about the process of cultural negotiation, how Chinese patient committed and carried out the processes. Were these early native Chinese doctors? Oh, these are all the questions I want to ask as well. And how did did Chinese patients end up in Donghua hospitals? I guess families, right? And Chinese doctors, well, in Donghua hospitals, there were before 1895, there were no Western doctors. They were all TCM practitioners, right? So they were, so actually in Hong Kong, a lot of Western doctors and also the government looked down on them, that's for sure. Who carried out the process of admitting patients? Really, this is a big question as well, that I haven't really seen enough materials in the archive, as well as in the newspapers. I mostly rely on the Colonial Office archives in the National Archives in London, and also old newspapers. How did Western conceptions of madness interact with those of Southern China? Right, so I would say that in Southern China, in Care's Refuge, that the idea of the Western concept of madness existed, and it was actually built by American missionaries. And there were the mental health workers. I don't know if they were properly trained psychiatrists. They worked in Care's Refuge, but not in the asylums in Hong Kong. The modern mental health concept and modern psychiatry did not really come here until end of Second World War, right? So, yeah.
Well, thank you. And did you see Jack has a question about opium? Yes. And opium addiction, and what role did that play in understandings of lunacy?
I have zero knowledge about this, the role of opium, right? But yeah, so good question. This is something yes. I really need to dig
look
up more.
Into, right? And Gina has asked about the female epileptic in your story. And could you say more about women and madness in colonial Hong Kong? and their trans-Pacific journey?
Okay, this is quite interesting that for that specific patient, I only had the information of she being an 80-year-old girl, and she was married at the age of 14. And clearly she was not really mad, she was epileptic. And then she was dumped by her family into the mental asylum, female mental asylum, right? And then, but quite interestingly, that when I talk about these cases of suicidal Chinese, a lot of them were women. Yeah. And so I said there are two categories of lunatics. First are violent sailors. They of course were mainly men, and then suicidal Chinese, they were mainly women, right? But of course, there were also suicidal men as well. There was a very interesting case in the Lancet, and well, it was very grotesque kind of description in the Lancet report, because that suicidal man was he lost his fiancée, and because his fiancée died from very long-term illness, and he he actually used out of his money supporting the medical care for his fiancée. And so he ran out of money, he wanted to die, and so he attempted to chop off his penis. And then there was a very, very detailed report on the Lancet magazine. I can clearly see that there is a kind of uncanny kind of a sentiment that you can read out in the medical report about how how a Chinese body is described in a Western medical journal, right? That kind of thing. Right?
Do you think that you could, do you have any theories about why the suicidal Chinese tended to be women and why it was gendered in that way?
Right, gender. Okay, so
I'm just thinking
okay.
what would be wanting you to.
Yeah, I know that I'm presenting in comparative literature, and this will be something people are concerned about.
It's very striking, right?
Yeah.
That you're saying they are mostly women. Do you have any theories about why?
I don't, and so I need to go back and really think more carefully. Yeah, but thank you. This is a very, very important aspect. I really need to elaborate. Yeah.
And so I think the next question is asking about your methodology here and your approach and how you see it as relating to complit.
Okay, my methodology, of course, is archival. So I look at colonial office archives in the National Archives in London, and also old newspapers available public. They are all available through the Hong Kong public library system, right? And it is very difficult to conduct this piece of research because of COVID, and we can't go anywhere. So most of the materials are found online, and thankfully that in the Hong Kong Library now has purchased some digitalized archives from the National Archives. It's called the Gale, right? It's very, very useful. It's modern China in the 19th and 20th century, right? So you can see all these. And I'm trying also to conduct several interviews, because I will be eventually touch upon the history, post-war history in Hong Kong, and a lot of them are still alive. Hong Kong people live very long, right? And so, for example, there are a lot of things left behind by the first properly trained psychiatrist, PM Yap, and he left a lot of his stuff in Hong Kong U, as well as in Castle Peak Hospital. So I'm trying to dig out those materials. Right.
Well, I think the next question was about the actual process of the journey to CARE's Refuge in Canton. Like, they must have been accompanied by someone, or were they put on a ship or a train and just sent there on their own?
Yes, they are accompanied by people of the Sanitary Board of Hong Kong. And then these people will get in touch with the health authority in Guangzhou City first, right? And then so these people, actually in Chinese is in Guangzhou Weisheng Ju, these people will wait at the port to receive the patients and then escort them to the CARES refuge.
I really like the next question. So if the suicidal people are being called Chinese here, should we assume the violent sailors you're referring to then were mostly Anglo-Saxon?
They are Anglo-Saxon. A lot of them are violent sailors, not only Anglo-Saxons. A lot of them are Europeans.
So how does this project fit in with your larger book project?
Right, so there will be several chapters, and this is just one little aspect, right? And of course, I will have a thorough survey of institutions in Hong Kong, and not only within Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is acquired by the British colony in different stages, right? So there are different asylums, and actually this is very interesting. Now there's the asylum ordinance that was passed in 1903. It actually gave the government power really to define institutions they like as asylums, right? So anywhere can be an asylum, right? So this is the beauty of the ordinance, that it doesn't really require any medical people. They don't need to consult people, medical people, to really define designate a lunatic, right? Yeah, and then so the development of different asylums is a chapter. Repatriation is a chapter, and I'm trying to look at after the Second World War. There are a lot of so-called madness and mad behaviors are politicized, right? And then after the Second World War, during the Cold War, there are a lot of people who came to Hong Kong via the border, and then they claimed that they were brainwashed by the communists. And so I'm going to talk about, in a chapter, all the politics about brainwashing and what it means to Hong Kong during Cold War, and also from 1960s and from 1970s, mental health became it came into people's really concern in public attention, and because of some crisis. And then there were, in Hong Kong, that was the time movie industry was quite prosperous. And then so some movie directors trying to portray lunatics, and for the purpose of, okay, now we have these people in our society, we need to really reform our facilities to take better care of them, right? For example, like Daiseng, he was an important movie director, and he made a movie called The Lunatics. In Cantonese, it's called Din Yan Zeng Jun, right? And then, but actually the consequences was just adverse, that people were more afraid of lunatics, right? So these categories of movies evolved from 1970s to after the millennium. To several years ago, there was a movie called The Mad World, or the Yan Moment, right? And well, this year there is another movie, right? So I'm going to talk about the evolution of this category of movie in Hong Kong as well. So there are these different aspects. Right?
Oh, that's really fascinating. And in your title, you talk about this being an ocean perspective of medical history. I'm very intrigued by that. Could you say a little bit more? I mean, how does having this ocean perspective, is it a different methodology to studying mental health history?
Oh, right. Okay, so if people who are interested in history of psychiatry, of history of madness, will not be unfamiliar with Michel Foucault, who actually talked about the ship of fools in the first chapter of his Madness and Civilization. And it seems it was a very medieval kind of practice, right? But actually in Hong Kong, it occurred as a chapter of modern psychiatry. Right? So he talked about before confinement, it was drifting. But in Hong Kong, its confinement was actually very, very small scale, but people are drifting in the ocean. So this is something that I want to emphasize in contrast to the conventional historiography of history of psychiatry.
Well, does anyone have any, we got another question from Nicole here. Could you talk a little bit more about the connections with pandemics in history? And how were lunatics placed in relation to other types of patients that required isolation, like infectious disease patients? Were they mentioned in the same context, or were these totally different categories of patients?
Okay, this is quite interesting that in the 19th century and perhaps early 20th century, I assume that in asylum there were a category of patients who were deemed lunatic, but actually it was syphilis that they contracted. And then in the third phase of syphilis, some of them would develop neurological and some mental symptoms. So some of them, this is the crossover between infectious and mental diseases. And I didn't find many stories like this in pre-Second World War history. But after the Second World War, there were discussions about whether or not these, for example, like flu would make people mad, right? And this is true. The medical reports are talking about that. Newspapers are talking about that, especially after, especially in 1957, and this was a famous Asian flu, right? Well, actually, this kind of description occurred in the late 19th century. There's a Russian flu, and people started to pay attention to flu psychosis. But actually, it was just people talked about it very briefly. And during the Cold War, 1957, Asian flu, people talked about that in the context of demonizing Asia, right? So there are also scientists really trying to study that seriously, to look at the real mechanism of how a flu can really cause madness.
Wow.
And then in 1968 as well, there's a Hong Kong flu, and people started to talk about it again. And nowadays, people did find the connection between brain and gut. But the real physiological pathogenesis of flu psychosis, right? Yeah, but not in the context of demonizing any part of the world anymore.
Oh, so we have another question here from Amber. So she's curious about the time gap in the treatment of lunatics in the UK and Hong Kong. So in 1841, the UK already had the Association of Medical Officers of Asylums and Hospitals for the Insane. But in Hong Kong, the problem of mental health and its medical treatment emerged until the Second World War.
Yeah.
Could you say more about the history of this?
Right, this is interesting. I mean, I think for Hong Kong, for the authority, is that they did not really want mental patients to appear at all in the colony. So there were different laws were trying to get rid of them and preventing them from landing in the port, right? And so you can see a lot of letters. The government is trying to ask the Secretary of Colonial Affairs, trying to really ask them to build a proper mental asylum in Hong Kong, but actually they all failed, right? So it reflects the governmentality of the colonial. At first it was a colonial officer, colonial government that it just like out of sight, out of mind mentality. But over time, people, including governors, they are aware the need to provide mental health care in Hong Kong, but then when they asked for the assistance from Britain, but actually they did not get anything. So in the end, that they had to negotiate with the Chinese Empire, right? And then so to make this care refuge happen. And so yeah, so the time lag, this is quite crazy. It's 100 years. Right? And actually, I have to say that before the end of Second World War, there was a psychiatrist who was hired in the University of Hong Kong, but he did not teach psychiatry. He published occasionally some popular psychiatric or psychoanalytic theories in medical journals. So trying to introduce these ideas to Hong Kong or this part of the world, because if you publish in, for example, like Caduceus, that the article published by the Medical Society in Hong Kong, it got circulated in East Asia. And so his work was in Hong Kong U teaching anatomy only, right? Wow. And then this guy is called Alexander Canning, and then he was a very curious guy. After he returned to Britain, well, when he was in Hong Kong, he got interested in a lot of, for example, like fortune telling, yin and yang stuff, like alternative treatment, this kind of thing. And then he became, when he returned to in London, he managed to acquire the license to practice psychiatry. But actually his interest was a lot of these occult medicine, so to say. And then he was influential to the Edward VIII. And then it was reported that he managed to mesmerize the king, and then leading to his abdiction, right? Becoming a quack. Right?
Well, we've got another question from Jack. So he wants to ask about how the end of the 19th century was also a moment of expanding toxicology in Hong Kong, intersecting with concerns over lunacy, like datura poisonings and hallucinations, which pop up a few times in the 1880s and 1890s. And so do you know if emerging toxicological science intersected with psychiatry in Hong Kong?
Well, I guess, Jack, this will be something that you want to...
Please feel free, Jack, to unmute yourself if you want to ask.
Right. Jack, if you have these information, welcome to just share with us.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sorry, Harry, go on.
Yeah, I only read something. This is, I don't think I can really write it down here. It's too irrelevant. There were times people talking about why in this part of the world it's easier for people to contract syphilis. Was that because in Hong Kong people eat fish? Fish.
Yeah, right. I see. I see. I think the point that I was, I guess, driving at is that at the same time as you have all of these concerns over lunacy, you have all of these worries and often just interest in all of these sort of chemicals and substances and plants that were also existing within this sort of cultural space.
Yeah.
And I think that particularly comes to the fore with opium, I guess. But there's a lot of quite weird stuff going on. So reports of datura poisonings, which occasionally crop up in the medical records. James Cantley, in his papers at the Wellcome Trust, there's him performing an analysis on a bottle of wine which had been mixed with the hallucinogenic Amanita muscaria mushroom. And so there's quite a lot of strange things going on. And I don't know, I'm just interested in how those sort of intersect with all these concerns over madness. Because they're definitely thinking about those things a lot, and often in similar ways that they seem to be thinking over madness at the time. So just bringing those things into conjunction, I think, would be really fascinating.
Yeah, I don't have any information about madness, but if you read China Medical Journal, and then there are a lot of reports, really instructions, really teaching doctors, missionaries practicing in this part of the world how to eat, right?
I see. And, yes.
Yeah. Well, are there any last questions, I guess, before we close? This was so fascinating. We do have a question here. Who were the people who had the say in classifying who were the lunatics or not? Very good question.
Okay, basically the police, right? And then according to the law, they need to, well, if it is, these people are properly managed, that you require a doctor, but we don't have psychiatrists here to assess these people in the hospital premises. And then, but oftentimes that people bypass these procedures. So you need doctors to assess these people, and you need the court to really decide whether or not the person should really stay in the hospital, or go home or anywhere. But actually in Hong Kong, we don't have psychiatrists. And also the court is very small. The magistrate is instead very big, right? So the police who are these people who define madness, and then they often have the final say. And then these people are brought to the magistrate, and these mad people belong to the magistrate, and then madness is just defined. Once it is labeled, it is labeled.
So you talk about the politicization of mental illness after World War II, but I wonder, aren't these categories like violent sailors and suicidal Chinese, aren't those inherently political categories too then, especially if it's the...
Oh yeah, very good. Yeah, I think this is a very good way of putting it.
So just pushing you here a little bit, I mean, was it ever not political?
It is always political. And then, well, if you read these more recent cases, you'll see they are so relevant to what is happening nowadays. For example, like in 1967, and there was this famous riot of Star Ferry riot, and the main person who initiated this, and he was labeled actually by all the mainstream newspapers as a mad person, and he was actually brought to the mental hospital for some assessment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we close, would you like to say anything about how your work has made you think about the pandemic we're in now and the mental health crisis that the world is facing currently?
Wow,
big question. Has it given you any insights or perspective?
It just gave me a new direction that, well, I am going to write something about the influence of pandemic in terms of, the mental consequences of pandemics, or not necessarily pandemics, epidemics, right? So I'm now trying to look back on 1968 about how people relate the experience of Russian flu, the flu psychosis, and then all these discourses about psychosis in Hong Kong flu, right? So it gives me some new inspiration. Right?
Seems like it's a third book project.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful having you present. And I think we are going to show some upcoming events before we close.
Yeah, I look forward to that one.
So upcoming is Manufacturing Childhood in Hong Kong, Literature in the Kingdom of Plastic Toys. Gina, would you like to say anything about it? Or okay, for updates, please go to the Facebook page or the Instagram or Twitter. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.